There have been a lot of promises made about the Jeffrey Epstein files over the years. And with this massive release that just happened, followed by what can only be described as an unprecedented scramble to delete thousands of documents within hours, we need to talk about what just went down. Okay, so let's get into this. On Friday, January 30th, 2026, the Department of Justice released what they claimed was the final massive dump of Jeffrey Epstein files. We're talking over 3 million pages of documents, 2,000 videos, and 180,000 images. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche stood up there at a press conference and said, quote, "Today's release marks the end of a very comprehensive document identification and review process to ensure transparency to the American people and compliance with the Act." He said over 500 lawyers worked through weekends and holidays to make this happen. They reviewed, according to Blanche, 6 million pages, which he described as 2 Eiffel Towers of pages. Sounds great, right? Transparency, accountability, finally getting answers about one of the most notorious convicted pedophiles and accused child sex traffickers in modern history. Except here's the problem. Within 24 hours, by Monday, February 2nd, the DOJ had to issue a letter to federal judges admitting they had, quote, taken down several thousands of documents and media that may have inadvertently included victim identifying information due to various factors, including technical or human error. Wait, what? Technical or human error? Let me be clear about what actually happened here, because this wasn't just a small mistake. This was, according to attorneys representing over 200 alleged victims, quote, the single most egregious violation of victim privacy in one day in United States history. That's not my words. That's what the lawyers told federal judges Richard Berman and Paul Engelmeyer. So what went wrong? Well, let me paint you a picture. The Epstein Files Transparency Act, which President Donald Trump signed into law on November 19th, 2025, had one main job. It required the DOJ to release all the files while protecting the identities of victims. That was the whole point. Expose the perpetrators, protect the survivors. Simple enough, right? Except the DOJ completely botched it. And I mean completely. Attorneys Brittany Henderson and Brad Edwards, who represent multiple survivors, wrote in a letter to the court that there were, quote, thousands of instances when the government had failed to redact names and other personally identifying information. They demanded an immediate takedown of the DOJ website hosting the Epstein materials and the appointment of a special master to oversee redaction and republication. Let me give you some specifics here because this gets worse. The Associated Press had dozens of reporters analyzing these files, and they found multiple occasions where a victim's name was redacted in one document, only to be left completely exposed in another version of the same file. In other places, names and email addresses were crossed out, but not fully blackened out, so they were still visible. Get this. Other text redactions could be easily overridden by simply double-clicking on them to reveal the hidden text underneath. I mean, come on, this is basic redaction stuff. The New York Times found dozens of uncensored photos of naked young women, possibly teenagers, with their faces completely unredacted. The Justice Department had said all nude or pornographic images were redacted from the 2,000-some videos and 180,000 images in the release, even if they were commercially produced, because the agency considered all women depicted in the images as potential victims. But that clearly didn't happen. A Wall Street Journal review found that at least 43 victims' full names were exposed in the files, including more than 24 who were minors when they were abused. Some of these names appeared over 100 times in the documents. Home addresses were visible in keyword searches. Banking information was out there. One survivor reported getting death threats after 51 entries included her private banking information, forcing her to try to shut down her credit cards and accounts. Danielle Bensky, a survivor who was a teenage ballerina when she says Epstein abused her 2 decades ago, told NBC News that what she thought were confidential conversations with FBI investigators about Epstein were included in the document dump. She said, quote, "I thought it was carelessness, and then I went to incompetence. And now it feels a bit deliberate. It feels like a bit of an attack on survivors." Let that sink in. She thinks it feels deliberate. And you know what? When you look at the pattern here, it's hard not to see why she would think that. Because here's what's really disturbing. The documents that got exposed that had victims' names and personal information all over them, those stayed up. But guess whose information got heavily redacted? The perpetrators, the enablers, the powerful people. Sky Roberts, the brother of Virginia Giuffre, one of Jeffrey Epstein's most vocal accusers who tragically died by suicide in 2025, said it perfectly on CBS Mornings. Quote, "They're redacting the names of perpetrators and they're unredacting the names of victims, quite the opposite of what the Epstein Files Transparency Act was meant to do." And it gets even more troubling when you look at what else was in these files that didn't get properly protected. There was an email showing Epstein's entire credit card number, expiration date, and security code. An interview transcript from the investigation into Epstein's suicide included a jail worker's full social security number and date of birth. A photo of one girl who was underage when she was hired to give sexualized massages to Epstein appeared in a chart of his alleged victims with no redaction at all. Meanwhile, as all of this victim information is being exposed, what about the powerful people? Well, they got mentioned all right. The files included references to President Trump, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Bill Clinton, Steve Bannon, and countless others. Some of these references were benign, some were concerning, but the DOJ made sure to include a very specific disclaimer about Trump. In their official statement, the DOJ said, quote, "This production may include fake or falsely submitted images, documents, or videos, as everything that was sent to the FBI by the public was included in the production that is responsive to the act. Some of the documents contain untrue and sensationalist claims against President Trump that were submitted to the FBI right before the 2020 election. To be clear, the claims are unfounded and false, and if they have a shred of credibility, they certainly would have been weaponized against President Trump already." Interesting, right? They took the time to specifically defend the president in their release statement, but they didn't take the time to properly redact victims' names and faces. They didn't take the time to make sure that double-clicking on a redacted section wouldn't reveal the hidden information underneath. Now let's talk about the timeline here because this matters. The Epstein Files Transparency Act gave the DOJ 30 days from November 19th, 2025 to release everything. They missed that deadline. They said they needed more time to properly protect victims' identities. Then on December 19th, 2025, they released an initial batch that was so heavily redacted, it drew bipartisan criticism. Over 500 pages were entirely blacked out in that release. Less than a day after that December release, 16 files disappeared from the public webpage without explanation. Then we get to Friday, January 30th, 2026, the big release, 3 million pages. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche says they're in full compliance with the law. He says, quote, "The department provided clear instructions to reviewers that the redactions were to be limited to the protection of victims and their families. Notable individuals and politicians were not redacted in the release of any files. So they specifically chose not to redact powerful people, but they somehow couldn't manage to redact the victims? Come on. By Sunday, February 1st, attorneys for the victims were demanding an emergency hearing. 8 women who identify as Epstein victims added comments to the letter to Judge Richard M. Berman. One wrote that the record's release was, quote, life-threatening. Henderson and Edwards wrote, quote, there is no conceivable degree of institutional incompetence sufficient to explain the scale, consistency, and persistence of the failures that occurred, particularly where the sole task ordered by the court and repeatedly emphasized by DOJ was simple: redact known victim names before publication. They added, quote, for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, every hour matters. The harm is ongoing and irreversible. This court is the last line of defense for victims who were promised protection and instead were exposed. Judicial intervention is not merely appropriate, it is essential. A hearing was scheduled for Wednesday, February 4th. But here's where it gets interesting. On Wednesday, attorney Brittany Henderson told NBC News that despite the DOJ promising to fix the redaction failures by noon that day, victims' identities remained publicly accessible. She said, quote, for 5 days, the Department of Justice has left the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein publicly exposed, named and personally identified on the government's own website, despite acknowledging that these disclosures were wrongful and agreeing to correct them immediately. The hearing got canceled after Henderson cited what she called extensive and constructive discussions with the government. But as of Wednesday evening, according to the Associated Press, despite the Justice Department's efforts to fix the oversights, a selfie taken by a nude female in a bathroom and another by a topless female remained on the site, their ages unknown, but their faces in full view. Now, you might be asking, how does something like this happen? How does the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world, with over 500 lawyers working on this, manage to mess up this badly? Well, there are really only 2 possibilities here. Either this was incompetence on a scale that's almost incomprehensible, or something else is going on. And when you look at the political context, things start to make more sense. President Trump promised during his 2024 campaign to release the Epstein files. He made it a cornerstone of his message about transparency and draining the swamp. But then something interesting happened. After he won and took office, his tune started to change. In July of 2025, Attorney General Pam Bondi released a statement saying the DOJ found, quote, no incriminating client list, contradicting her earlier February statement where she had said the list was, quote, sitting on my desk right now to review. On July 12th, Trump defended Bondi and referred to Epstein as, quote, somebody that nobody cares about. On July 16th, Trump referred to the Epstein files as, quote, a big hoax. This drew criticism even from Trump's own supporters. Joe Rogan accused the Trump administration of gaslighting the public. Andrew Schultz said Trump was, quote, insulting our intelligence. Then Congress forced his hand with the Epstein Files Transparency Act, which passed the House 427-1 and passed the Senate unanimously. Trump signed it, but without reporters present. So we end up with this release that supposedly provides transparency, but it's done in such a sloppy, careless way that it ends up victimizing the victims all over again while somehow managing to provide cover for powerful people. And here's another thing. The DOJ claims they reviewed 6 million pages, but only released about 3.5 million. They say the rest are duplicates or unrelated materials. But Representative Ro Khanna and other Democratic lawmakers dispute this. Khanna said, quote, "The DOJ said it identified over 6 million potentially responsive pages, but is releasing only about 3.5 million after review and redactions. This raises questions as to why the rest are being withheld." Khanna specifically said he's looking for FBI witness interviews. He said, quote, "I know from survivors and survivors' lawyers that when they had these conversations with FBI agents, they specifically named other men who they were trafficked to or who showed up at these parties. So where are those interviews? Why aren't they in the release?" A December 2025 Reuters poll found that 23% of Americans approved of Trump's handling of the Epstein case. A January 2026 CNN poll found that 49% of Americans were dissatisfied with how much of the Epstein files the federal government has released so far, while only 6% were satisfied. 2/3 of respondents said the government was deliberately withholding information. And you know what? Based on what we've seen, it's hard to blame them for thinking that. Look, I'm not saying that everyone mentioned in these files did something wrong. Being in Epstein's orbit doesn't automatically make you guilty of anything. The files include business contacts, social acquaintances, people who knew him in various capacities. As Deputy Attorney General Blanche said, quote, "The American people need to understand that it isn't a crime to party with Mr. Epstein. But here's what is a crime, or at least it should be: promising to protect survivors and then exposing them to the world. Taking their most painful, traumatic experiences and putting them out there for everyone to see, complete with their names, their faces, their personal information, while they're still dealing with the aftermath of what happened to them." Annie Farmer, who said she was 16 when she was sexually assaulted by Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, told NBC News, quote, "At this point, I'm feeling really most of all angry about the way that this unfolded. The fact that it's been done in such a beyond careless way, where people have been endangered because of it, is really horrifying." She added, quote, "So many of us worked so hard to speak to congressional leaders, to talk to senators, to talk to anybody we possibly knew had any power, to say, we want this done the right way." Danielle Bensky said survivors had a meeting with House Speaker Mike Johnson, where she said the Republican, quote, "looked us dead in the eye and promised to protect the victims. Then this happens." The political fallout from all of this is still unfolding. There are reports that this is affecting Trump's approval ratings, which are already at record lows for a first-year president. There's talk of impeachment or contempt proceedings against Attorney General Pam Bondi if the Justice Department doesn't address the remaining objections about the handling of the documents. Overseas, there have been consequences. Peter Mandelson resigned from the Labour Party and the House of Lords amid disclosures that he shared private government information with Epstein. Joanna Rubinstein resigned from her position as the chair of Sweden for UNHCR after the files revealed she had visited Epstein's private island in 2012. Polish authorities are investigating whether Epstein had links to Russian intelligence. But in the United States, where most of the alleged crimes occurred, where most of the victims are, the main consequence so far has been the re-victimization of survivors. As of today, Wednesday, February 5th, 2026, the DOJ claims it's working to fix the problems. They've taken down thousands of documents. They're supposedly re-reviewing and re-redacting, but the damage is done. Once information is out there on the internet, it's out there forever. Screenshots have been taken. Information has been copied and shared. So what do we make of all this? Was this truly just incompetence, technical and human error on an unprecedented scale? Or was there something more deliberate going on? I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions, but I'll say this. When the government can't manage to properly redact victim information, but make sure to include disclaimers defending the president, when they release only half of the files they identified as relevant, when they heavily redact powerful people while leaving victims exposed, you have to wonder what the real priority was here. The Epstein Files Transparency Act was supposed to bring transparency and justice. Instead, we got another layer of cover-up and another round of pain for the people who have already suffered the most. That's all we have for you right now. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe.